Separation. It meant a father who could not or would not cross a line drawn not by distance, but by devotion to a belief system that placed doctrine above daughters. And that realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, the way a cold does, until one morning she woke up and realized she had been sick for years without ever naming the illness. She didn't grow up hating Tom Cruise. Hate would have been easier. Hate has edges and boundaries, and eventually it burns itself out. What she grew up with was something quieter and far more damaging. She grew up hoping for a text on her birthday, hoping for a face in the crowd at her school play, hoping for an ordinary moment that any ordinary father would have considered unremarkable. But the older she became, the more she understood that hope, when it is never answered, doesn't stay hope. It becomes grief. And she had been grieving a living person since she was 6 years old. At 15, she walked into the kitchen one morning and caught her mother quietly wiping her eyes after reading an article about Tom's latest blockbuster premiere. The film had broken opening weekend records. The internet was celebrating, and Katie Holmes was standing at the kitchen counter, trying to compose herself before her daughter saw. But Suri saw. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. There are things a daughter and mother understand between them without language, truths that live in a glance, in the particular way someone turns toward the window so you won't see their face. Katie had carried the weight of her daughter's emotional abandonment for years, absorbing the questions she couldn't fully answer, softening the edges of a reality that was too sharp for a child to hold. She never spoke badly about Tom. Not once, not in public, not in the carefully worded interviews she gave, and not, according to those close to her, in private either. She shielded Suri not with lies, but with timing, holding back the full weight of the truth until her daughter was old enough to carry it without being crushed. Some truths are too painful to give a child before they are ready. And by 16, Suri was finally ready. Not for the media's version of the truth, which had been narrated and re-narrated by tabloids for a decade, but for her own. The version she had assembled herself from years of observation, from silences and absences and the particular arithmetic of a father who was everywhere on screen and nowhere in her life. Finding her voice at 18. Turning 18 in April 2024 was not just a birthday for Suri. It was a threshold, a legal and emotional line she had been walking toward for years. It was the moment the law finally recognized her as someone who could make her own decisions, speak her own truth, and define her identity without permission from anyone, including the man whose last name she had carried her entire life without ever feeling it truly belonged to her. In the weeks leading up to her birthday, she worked on her college application essays, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to reach into the years of accumulated silence and pull something honest out of them. She wrote about absence, about the particular shape a missing parent leaves in a childhood, about learning to build a self in the negative space of someone else's choices. She wrote, "Sometimes we don't grow up with love. We grow up with the space that love leaves behind." It was the first time she had ever articulated, even privately on paper, what she had felt since she was 6 years old, sitting in the back of a car watching the distance between herself and her father grow into something permanent. She didn't mention him by name. She didn't need to. The entire world knew exactly who she meant. And yet, for the first time, the story belonged to her and not to the headlines that had been written about her since before she could read. While other teenagers celebrated their 18th birthdays with parties and the uncomplicated joy of a milestone, Suri spent part of hers in quiet reflection, standing in front of a mirror and seeing, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, not a celebrity's daughter or a tabloid fixture or a symbol of Hollywood's most public divorce, but simply herself. A young woman who had spent nearly half her life mourning someone who was still very much alive and choosing every single day not to call. She understood in that moment that she no longer needed to perform the waiting. She no longer needed to maintain the posture of a daughter expecting her father to return. The phone call was not coming. The explanation was not coming. And the extraordinary thing was that she had found, somewhere in the long years of understanding that, not bitterness, but a strange and quiet peace. On May 17th, 2024, she signed the paperwork to legally change her name to Suri Noel Holmes. The decision had been forming for a long time. She chose her mother's middle name, Noel, not as a rejection of her origins, but as a declaration of where she had actually been raised, who had actually shown up, whose hands had actually held her through every difficult thing. She didn't cry when she signed it. She had expected to. Instead, what came was relief. Deep, uncomplicated, bone-level relief. The kind that arrives when a person stops bracing for an impact that has already happened and realizes they survived it. The world noticed the name change immediately. It appeared first in her high school graduation program, then on the cast list for her performance in the Addams Family musical, a production that drew quiet admiration from those who saw it. Later, it appeared on her acceptance documents for Carnegie Mellon University, one of the most respected arts and design institutions in the country, where she was admitted to study fashion. People called the name change an act of rebellion. Journalists framed it as a statement against her father. But those who knew her said it was neither dramatic nor defiant. It was simply the last administrative step in a process of becoming herself that had been underway for years. It was an act of freedom. The kind of girl earns only after surviving 12 years of silence with her identity intact, stepping into a life without his shadow. By the time Suri began her freshman year at Carnegie Mellon in the fall of 2024, she had already done the interior work that most people spend their entire 20s trying to complete. She arrived on campus not as a girl running from something, but as a young woman walking deliberately towards something she had chosen entirely for herself. She was no longer the child whose every stroller ride was documented by photographers camped outside her front door. No longer the girl the world pitted at a distance, watching her grow up in the particular loneliness of having a famous, absent father. And no longer the living symbol of a marriage that the entertainment industry had once treated as a fairy tale and then as a scandal. She was simply a student, riding the Pittsburgh subway with a bag full of sketchbooks, sitting in design studios, developing a visual language that was entirely her own, living, for the first time in her life, at a scale that matched who she actually was rather than who the world had decided she must be. Katie visited her often in those early months. She helped carry boxes up dormitory staircases and sat with her daughter over coffee in small Pittsburgh cafes, doing the unremarkable, irreplaceable things that good mothers do. She had raised this person through conditions that would have broken a less grounded woman, through the dissolution of a very public marriage, through years of navigating co-parenting arrangements complicated by institutional pressure, through the long loneliness of being a single mother in a city that never stopped watching. In interviews, she remained measured and gracious, offering only a sentence when asked about her daughter. She is an incredible person, but the people who knew them both understood that Suri's groundedness, her ability to emerge from an objectively difficult childhood without bitterness or instability, came directly from the consistency and dignity of her mother's example. Meanwhile, Tom Cruise continued his life at its characteristic velocity. Mission Impossible sequels, a historic collaboration with NASA and SpaceX to film sequences partially in actual orbit around the Earth, a project that generated enormous press and reflected his almost compulsive commitment to physical extremity. New franchise deals, new stunts that continued to defy both physics and actuarial tables. The world cheered. It always did. He had built a career on the understanding that audiences would forgive a man almost anything if he was willing to dangle from a moving aircraft to entertain them. But what no studio deal and no stunt coordinator could manufacture was the simple, private act of crossing a room toward a daughter who had needed him for over a decade. Insiders confirmed that financial obligations continued to be met. Education costs, medical expenses, the terms set out in the 2012 custody settlement were reportedly honored. But a check is not a presence, and a settlement is not a relationship. He had not been seen with Suri publicly in more than 10 years. No photographs, no confirmed visits, no reported phone calls. The gap between them had not narrowed. It had simply been agreed upon, in some unspoken way, as permanent. Suri, now 19, has made her peace with that permanence. Not the false peace of someone who has suppressed what they feel, but the real and hard-won peace of someone who has looked clearly at the truth and decided it will not define them. She no longer checks her phone on her birthday with that particular, fragile kind of hope. She no longer rehearses conversations in her head that will never take place. She no longer stands at any doorway, metaphorical or otherwise, waiting for a man who stopped walking toward her when she was very small. Instead, she walks forward, into design studios and subway cars, and the ordinary, beautiful chaos of a life that belongs entirely to her. And the little girl who once reached up for arms that weren't there now moves through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who built herself from scratch, with her mother beside her and her own name on her paperwork. Suri Noel Holmes. For the first time in her life, the truth isn't something she has to be protected from. It is something she carries lightly because she finally chose it herself. Her story raises a question that has no easy answer. If you had spent your entire childhood waiting for a parent who never came, and then finally found peace without them, would you reach out one more time? Or would you honor the life you built in their absence by finally, completely letting go? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more untold stories that the headlines never tell the whole way through.